Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 15. This is going to be our last lecture. We do still have class next week, so be studying for the final that is going to be available next week. And we're going to talk about the Americas, but I'm also going to talk about some extra credit and the Inferno real quick. So extra credit, if you would like to do it, it is due by this Sunday by 11:59, and you have to write a 3-page, 12-point Times New Roman, double-spaced analysis of a Native American tribe from North America. So it has to be from Canada, the United States, or Mexico. And you may not choose any of the tribes that I talk about in this lecture. If you get that in, it's worth half of a grade point up to a nice half grade point bump. So if you're at a, say, B, you can bump you up to a B plus. If you're at a B plus, maybe an A minus, right? So that'd be worth it for you. Okay. Also, number 2, Dante's Inferno is due this week. Make sure that you're analyzing the people that Dante meets, not the creatures, the people that he meets in Canto 1 and how they compare to the creatures that you find, or the people rather, that you find further in the other layers of hell. All right, without much ado, we're going to talk about the Americas. And already, just so you know, as of the making of this video, there has been new evidence that uncovers that puts in more doubt the New World theory of migration, also known as the land bridge theory. It seems less and less likely that all Native Americans came from Asia. In fact, it seems to put more emphasis instead on the wave theory of migration. That is, that people came across in multiple different impulses across multiple different time periods, and they seem to have taken many different paths. They may have island hopped and taken boats, canoes, or similar vehicles across water. They may also have used land bridges to the south and also in the Atlantic. Okay, so what we do know, however, is that there are Native Americans that appear on both North and South America roughly between 50,000 and 15,000 BCE. And here's an idea of what that land bridge theory might be. Now imagine the ocean levels are much lower during the Great Ice Age, the last Great Ice Age, so that places like the Marshall Islands right here would instead be a kind of land bridge or maybe even a land mass itself. Remember, at this time, even England and Ireland were connected to Europe through land bridges. So there we have that. One of the problems with studying this chapter is a similar problem that we ran into when we were talking about Africa. And that is that there are a lot of different nations in North America. There are various different tribes, and each of the little names that you see here is a different tribe that may have a vastly different language, religious, cultural, or traditional scheme than its neighbors do. The same is true for South America. There are a plethora of nations in both North and South America, giving us literally thousands of different tribes that we could examine. So this leads us to things that we need to forget, or some of the mythologies that have grown up around Native Americans. First, there is no Native or Indian culture per se. There are cultures that are Native, First Nation, or Indian. Native American tribes are not homogeneous, and there is great variety among even close neighbors. You also have to forget this idea of innocence. A lot of the counter argument to European intervention and that is often brought up on Columbus Day is that Native American tribes were just innocent babes in the woodland. They were living a simple life until Europeans came along and made everything more complicated. That is absolutely not true. Native American tribes were incredibly sophisticated. Some developed mathematics, astronomy, medicine, surgery, complex city planning, and more. Hand in hand with that is we have to forget that Native Americans were supposedly eco-friendly or closer to the earth. Some tribes absolutely were, but some were not. Some practiced cannibalism, some practiced human sacrifice, some overpolluted, overhunted, overfarmed, overfished, and worked their way out of an environment and into oblivion. A good example would be the Cahokia. So with that out of our heads, we now need to move into Northeast America, and we're going to look at one of the many tribes. Remember, this tribe is off limits for your extra credit. And that is the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the long houses. The Iroquois is a French term that was given to these five tribes or five nations, also known as the Six Nations, because the Sixth Nation joins them in the mid 17th century. So they are the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, the Onondagas, and then later on the Tuscaroras. And they're held together in a loose association known as a confederacy. Politically speaking, they did have a constitution, an actual physical document that outlined their rights and responsibilities. Some of those rights and responsibilities included things like each of the chiefs had equal say in Confederacy matters. So if something affected all of the Confederacy, then each of the chiefs had a say and they had to vote. Within the tribe themselves, let's say we were the Mohawk tribe, the chiefs had a council, and each of the counselors had an equal say within their tribes, and the chief had to abide by the decisions of the council. Debates were conducted over internal and external issues, and a full consensus must be reached before a vote was concluded. So there's none of this three-fifths majority or two-thirds majority or anything like that. And they used a lot of this, or I'm sorry, they didn't use, they recorded a lot of this in wampum. Wampum is a token of political agreements. It is not used as money, although Europeans did eventually wind up using it as money in the early part of settlement in North America because of the lack of physical coins that were present in North America. So something like the agreement to be able to trade furs with the Native American tribes, or the ability to farm a certain area or fish in a certain creek, were very valuable, and they could be used as bargaining chips or as a method of paying off debt. And so the idea that wampum was money was probably misconstrued from the very get-go, but it was only perpetuated and made worse in mid 20th century films about Westerns. And here's what wampum may have looked like. In fact, the belts on the left are actually taken from Native American museums. Wampum is also the collective name for the shells that are used, the little blue and white shells there. And they themselves are worth a lot of money because they come from oceans and they are handcrafted and they are very, very difficult to make. Culturally speaking, women in Iroquois society actually had it better than women in European societies at the same time. Women did have a slightly lower status than men, but women could participate in tribal affairs, including helping to shape policy by rebuking chiefs publicly. They could also vote in tribal affairs. Women participated in warfare as well. When prisoners were taken for adoption or capture, it was women who decided who would be tortured and who would be left alive, who would be integrated into Native American society. And just to give you an idea, actually being integrated into Native American society when you were a child turned out to be kind of a sweet deal. And I will put some information up in the additional resources for you to look through. And I highly recommend it because it's extremely eye-opening. I'll just give you the TLDR right now, and that is that if you were a child and you were captured by the Iroquois Confederacy, you got to stay a child. You got to play, you got to do the things that you wanted. You slept in, you did whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, and the tribe looked after you. Comparing that to, say, puritanical society that by the time you were 7 or 8, you were expected to be working in the field, and that playing and laughing and joking and having fun was seen as basically a moral failing. Women also played a huge role in agriculture. It, the Iroquois Confederacy for a long time was mostly hunter-gatherer, but once they did settle down, women played a huge role in farming, particularly beans, squash, and corn. The Iroquois Confederacy was so strong and so well organized that by the 18th century it was mentioned in letters by Benjamin Franklin, who was trying to drum up support for a North American colonial Congress, or a Congress of the Americas. The Iroquois Confederacy was a object of fascination for Benjamin. In fact, he wrote one time to a friend of his, James Parker, in 1751, that it would be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union and be able to execute it in such a manner that it has subsisted ages and appears indissoluble. In other words, it can't be divided or can't be dissolved. And yet that a like union should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies, to whom it is more necessary and must be more advantageous, and who cannot be supposed to want an equal understanding of their interests. In other words, it's amazing to him that the British are rejecting this confederacy form and would rather stand alone. He found it absolutely flummoxing. So I want you to consider the oral history of the Iroquois, because they don't have a written history the way that Europeans do, but they do have documents. How valuable is the oral history to these people? And what does it tell us about the Confederacy itself? And also, what similarities do we see between the European and Iroquois political impulses? Now let's shift our gears a little bit and head south. And we're going to visit the Aztec. Now, Aztec is a term that was imposed from outside that was eventually adopted by the Spanish, and it's used to describe a Shimashek tribe from northern Mexico. Now, the Shimashek literally means an uncivilized or barbarous tribe in the Mexica language. The Mexica, of which the Aztecs are a part, is from the namesake of where we get Mexico from. The Aztecs referred to themselves as the Tenochca instead, a tribe within this kind of cultural linguistic family in central Mexico. And they started off as vassals of vastly stronger tribes. They were basically the mercenaries of Mexico. And for their part, um, the master group looked at these vassal Aztecs as important because of the religious proclivities of the Aztecs. And I'll get to that in just a little bit here, which you may have an inkling of. But let's just say that religion and wars go hand in hand for the Aztecs. Eventually, they served their masters so well that they were awarded a plot of land in the middle of a swampy lake that would then eventually become Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, by the time the Spanish viewed it for the first time, they thought they were gazing on a mirror image of Venice, because it was a city of canals, a very well ordered, very clean, very efficient city. And this is an idea of what the Aztec Empire at its height looked like. Now, Tenochtitlan was the foremost in a union of city-states, not unlike the Mycenaean Greeks, in that Tenochtitlan had basically veto power over any of the other decisions by some of the other Aztec city-states. So, for instance, if Tuxpan passed a decree about something, or if a priest made a presumption and said that this is the way that the religion's supposed to be, it could hold sway unless somebody from Tenochtitlan, like the emperor, or the high priest at Tenochtitlan, countermanded it. Then, of course, Tenochtitlan's decrees were law. Aztec culture centers around warfare, and often the society's divisions could be seen most clearly in the divisions of the different warrior castes. For instance, the jaguar were the very tippy top, high born aristocracy. Below them were the eagle warriors. Eagle warriors were drawn from the commanders of the army and the priestly caste. The Ententin were the ones that were third tier, the artisanal former former freemen who'd worked their way up, that sort of thing. And then at the very bottom are the kind of cannon fodder, or the majority of the army, the Kechike. The Kechike were they could be slaves. Often slaves were forced to fight in the army, but they could also be farmers or day laborers or that sort of thing. And your status within the military depended on several things, one of which was your ability to capture prisoners. If you captured prisoners, and that's the thing with Aztec warfare, is it wasn't all out kill all the enemies warfare. It was cow enough of the enemies that you can capture some of the prisoners. You can knock people unconscious and you can take them as prisoner. If you captured prisoners, you had status because you were able to do this, and that status could then be used to move you up the social ladder. Otherwise, you were stuck on the caste that you were born in. Some of these prisoners were sacrificed. In fact, most of these prisoners were sacrificed to the gods, and I'll touch on that in just a little bit here. And that sacrifice was a reflection of your piety. Technologically speaking, the Aztecs were very sophisticated. In addition to having a complex calendar system, a really good understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and physics, city planning, and more, and engineering, they were also very good metal workers. They made very complex and beautiful works of out of precious metals. They just didn't turn that attention to the making of metal tools. They still use stone tools, largely because of the profusion of a material known as obsidian. Obsidian is a type of volcanic glass. It's black, it's dense, and it's extremely sharp. In fact, modern scalpels now use, most of the time, obsidian blades. Some of the best blades are these obsidian blades, and it is a sliver of glass that can be refined all the way down to 1 micron thick. That is the width of one molecule. So why do you need it that sharp? Well, sharp blades make clean cuts. Clean cuts heal faster. Faster healing reduces the chances of infection and the visibility of scars. So there you go. And this is an idea of what the warriors might have looked like. In fact, right here at the very center with the white there, that is a jaguar warrior with all of his regalia. So, and you'll also notice at the very end these spears up here. They have these little nubs. Those are shards of obsidian. They also carried swords that had shards of obsidian as well. They often threw scimitars, or I'm sorry, they threw javelins rather. These javelins right here, which were blocked by these, could be blocked by these shields. Spears were usually melee weapons. They usually weren't thrown, and they were fairly easy to repair. So how did the empire get founded? Well, a semi-mythical legendary leader named Itzcoatl, he established the Aztec Empire after he betrays that master group that his people had been working for a few decades. While he was amassing more and more fighters, and while he was amassing more and more wealth and land as reward for his people's service, he also began plotting against them. The Aztecs themselves had a relentless and savage reputation that would allow them to cow or to intimidate nearby tribes into giving them sacrifices or giving them tribute. So lots of times the Aztecs actually didn't have to go to war. It was just the threat of war that made them so scary. And it was all resulted in this immense uh, accumulation of wealth and power. A lot of it was centered around religion, particularly human sacrifice. Human sacrifice was an important part of Aztec religion, but there's also a little bit of grain of salt that we have to take with this, but I'll touch on that in just a moment. It it propelled them to build these massive temple structures that were pyramidal in shape. They had these nice huge, very intricate temples. They also had aqueducts bringing in fresh water to the cities. They had a very well-ordered society. They had a very low crime rate. They had roads that were sophisticated roads connecting all of the different city-states and facilitating trade within and out of the empire. And of course, they had sewers, something that Europeans would not have for about 150 or 200 years after the collapse of the Aztec Empire. And they had a very highly centralized government. As I mentioned before, Tenochtitlan was the center of power, and if Tenochtitlan made a decree, the rest of the city-states had to fall in line. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures did have this sense of religious obligation to sacrifice to the gods, particularly human sacrifice, which was considered the ultimate sacrifice. But why? Well, part of it had to do with the mythology of the Aztecs. They believed that the world had already ended, or rather, that it should have already ended, and that it was this epic sacrifice by the gods of all their blood and their life force that was preventing the world from succumbing into darkness, chaos, and death. And so by sacrificing humans, you're infusing the gods with life force and blood, and that kept the world going. Now, some human sacrifices were volunteers out of piety, and those were treated well before their death, but the majority of them were not willing sacrifices. Other sacrifices could be made as well, and in fact, there seems to be emerging evidence that right about a couple of decades before Spanish contact with the Aztecs, that there was a shift that started to happen, that there weren't as many people to sacrifice, and also it was creating a lot of problems with neighbors, and so human sacrifice started tapering off. Instead, you could sacrifice blood. You would pour blood, you would cut yourself, pour blood into a vessel, and sacrifice that. And it also benefited your station. If you had slaves, an abundance of slaves, yeah, sure, you sacrificed a slave. If you didn't have a lot of slaves, but you wanted to be really pious, you sacrificed blood. If you couldn't sacrifice blood, realistically, if you were like a farmer or an artisan who needed to work every day, you could sacrifice things like feathers, clay, or wooden figurines that were symbolic sacrifices. So it seemed that the Aztec Empire started shifting away from actual human sacrifice into more symbolic ones. In fact, it is Spanish missionaries and conquistadors which are the majority of the tales of human sacrifice. So can we take them at their word? Are they going to be 100% honest? Or are they going to play up the savagery, play up the barbarism, play up the non-Christian nature of these Native Americans? So is that indeed tainted fruit? Let's move a little further south and talk about the Incas. The Incas were, again, much like the Aztecs, a very minor tribe until about the 15th century. They rise through prominence through conquest of their neighbors and quickly established an empire that rivaled in size, if not in duration, the Roman Empire in Europe. Incan cities took advantage of high ground uh, along the mountain ranges in South America. And this is a benefit because it makes it harder for you to be invaded. But there's also a disadvantage in that if you're living on top of a mountain, you have to travel a long way to get access to your food and to take care of your crops. In fact, most of your day might be spent going up and down the mountain. So, how do we address this? Well, the way that the Incas addressed it was to farm in tiers, or they cut steps in the sides of hills. This is similar to what the Southeast Asians and South Chinese did to address some of the shortfalls in land management in order to grow enough crops. Tiers give you several advantages. First, they make it much easier to farm the side of a hill. Second, they prevent soil erosion. Third, they allow for the accumulation of water that could then be released and flow down these tiers, so made irrigation a little bit easier. And finally, it allowed for a wider variety of crops in the Andes Mountains. So you can have crops that do very well with little sunlight facing perhaps northwards, or you have crops that do very well with lots of sunlight facing west, perhaps. They also had extensive roads that connected their city-states and their fortress cities one to the other. Incan society, like Aztec society, was also rigidly hierarchical. At the very top, you had the emperor, or sapas, as well as the generals. Below them were the priests, architects, and commanders that made the cities the way that they are and made the empire the way that it was, strong, right? And then below them were the general hoi polloi, the plebeians, the farmers, artisans, herders, and rank and file military people. Women seem to have a fairly vibrant role within the Incan society as well. They could act as advisors. They often acted in accordance with their station. In fact, it seems station and not gender was what mattered the most, because the wives of generals and commanders and priests and architects all could call upon the position of their husband as authority for themselves and their household. Gold and gems were definitely used by the Incas and mined ex extensively, but they didn't use them as money. So they had this very complex bartering system instead. They didn't believe that gold and jewels had any monetary value or any value per se, and instead things like food would be used, coca beans would be used as a kind of currency. Art and architecture also went hand in hand for the Incas. The Incas had very precise stone cutting, largely because if you're living in the Andes Mountains, you're going to experience a lot of earthquakes. So you want to keep things from moving around too much. They also had built-in drainage and irrigation to keep their cities from flooding. One of the interesting aspects of the Incas is that they were the only Native American tribes who had access to a native beast of burden, or a beast that could be turned into a beast of burden. And those are the alpacas and the llamas. Alpacas and llamas are able to carry way more than their body weight. So that makes them ideal pack animals for trade along trade routes. And so they were crucial to Indian trade. In fact, alpacas and llamas were so crucial that often they were depicted as a kind of demigod or a spirit animal, as we see with the gold statue right here. They also were crucial because they provided fur, which could be woven into a kind of wool cloth, which kept people warm. They provided milk and meat, and transportation, as I mentioned before. They were never really successfully exported by the Incas because the alpacas and the llamas evolved for cold, dry air, and so moving anywhere that wasn't cold and dry makes them susceptible to some respiratory problems. The Incan religion centered around the worship of the sun, and in fact, many of those temples were centered on the highest point of those mountain fortresses. And they obviously believed in an afterlife. Nobles and rich were mummified with their treasures And unlike, say, Egyptian mummification, this was a kind of au naturel mummification. They would put these nobles in caves that are very high up in the mountains, where the dry, cold air would prevent their bodies from rotting. And of course, they would desiccate because it was dry air. And so you have very naturalistic looking mummies, sort of like this little girl here, who is it looks like she might be asleep. Let me go ahead and do. There we go. That's a little bit better. It looks like she might be sleeping. It's hard to tell. And so there is the extent of the Incan Empire right along the Andes Mountains. They were able to craft this empire largely because of their very centralized government, the use of roads, and a very robust military as well. The Incans are kind of a hybrid of the two previous tribes that we looked at. They assimilated tribes through both peaceful means and through conquest. So peaceful, similar to the way that the Iroquois expanded their confederacy, and also similar to the Aztecs in that sometimes they conquered their neighbors. The economy was centrally planned, and in fact, taxes were not paid in money per se, but often paid in goods or sometimes the promise of labor. So, a certain amount of time spent on public works, building roads, temples, or whatever. The afterlife in Incan belief was also kind of interesting and one that I like as well. They obviously believed in an afterlife, and they believed that you should not lie, steal, or be idle. Don't be lazy. If you don't, if you are honest, if you don't steal, and if you're active in your life, you get to go to a meadow of flowers and be bathed by the warmth of the sun for eternity. If, however, you are dishonorable, if you lie, steal, cheat, are lazy, if you're just a bad person, your soul is doomed to wander the cold earth for all eternity. All right, guys, that is it. This is our last lecture together. I want to say thank you very much for sticking with me for these 16 weeks. Don't forget, next week is finals week, so you do have to study for it. There won't be a lecture, but I expect you to be studying for it. Please have that final in before the due date so that if there's any problems, you can contact me. Also, extra credit, as I mentioned before, must be in by Sunday, this Sunday by 11:59, the same as the Inferno analysis. And again, just to recap, that extra credit is you choose a tribe from North America, so Canada, the United States, or Mexico, and you explore an aspect of them. I want you to analyze them. Tell me about their political structure or their social structure or whatever like that in 3 pages, 12-point Times New Roman, submitted for up to a half grade point adjustment. Also, with the Inferno analysis, make sure that you are analyzing the people that Dante meets, not the creatures that he meets, because he meets some creatures as well. I want you to analyze the people. Who does he meet in the first circle of hell? Why are those people there? What is this level of hell like? And why is it the way that it is? And how does that compare to, say, the second layer or the third layer or the ninth layer of hell? All right, guys, that is it for this week. And I hope you have a great break, and maybe I'll see you again next term.